The Darkstalkers series of fighting games is something of a cult classic. With their most recent full game release being in 1997, the series runs the risk of falling further into obscurity. As an attempt to preserve some of the series' legacy, as well as to illustrate fighting game lore can be rather entertaining, this video will cover the official storyline of the Darkstalkers games. Hellstorm, 200 million years ago. On the distant star called Hellstorm, a society of intelligent life forms evolved. While many of the details of the society were unknown, one of these life forms was named Pyron. Pyron had an ability to continuously evolve throughout his lifespan. As he continued to evolve, he eventually attained immortality as an ultimate form of life. He was not bound to a singular shape or body, rather he was more like an amalgamation of shapeless energy. That said, Pyron often assumed a gigantic, muscular, and horned humanoid form that appeared as if it was made of fire itself. Personality-wise, Pyron was understandably arrogant and condescending. He operated as though he had no equal, which very well may have been true. This ultimate life form had the power to conquer the universe, yet he still searched for reasons to exist. He came to the task of collecting planets that he thought were beautiful. He would travel through the cosmos at the speed of light, searching for planets that caught his eye. Whenever he would find one, he would exert his incredible power to force that planet to orbit himself. That was how Pyron spent his time over the hundreds of millions of years, adding to his collection of planets. He even planned on adding a sun to his collection in time. However, 65 million years ago, Pyron came across the planet Earth, which he found particularly interesting. Pyron noticed that life forms had grown upon the planet. He probed the planet with a pulse of energy and was pleased with how some of the life forms reacted. It seemed as though these life forms were familiar with Pyron's other reason for existence: battle. Excitement of this type was rare for the ultimate life form, so he took the opportunity to partake. Pyron condensed his immense size into something closer to the size of the planet's life forms. Furthermore, he gave himself a form that followed the common rules of the planet. Namely, he made himself visible and physically interactable. Then Pyron submerged himself in the Pacific Ocean. Within the ocean's depths, he awaited his exciting battle. Earth, 65 million years ago. While Pyron awaited a future battle, an army of robots named Phobos, aka Huitzil, were created with the directive to cleanse the planet of life. It was unclear if Pyron himself created the army, or if another alien life form was responsible. Either way, this was seemingly some type of test for the planet's creatures. Utilizing their array of advanced weaponry, the army of Phobos enacted their orders and wiped the planet of its dominant life forms. These were the dinosaurs that walked the Earth at the time. With their job complete, the army of Phobos robots went dormant. Following an earthquake, they were buried underground in present-day Mexico. However, the dinosaurs were not the only life forms on the planet. Smaller, warm-blooded creatures survived and continued to evolve. Makai, over 2 million years ago. A realm existed much different than the one containing Earth. This was Makai, which would come to be known as the Demon Realm. Details of Makai's origin were recorded in the in-universe book titled Genesis of Makai. Of course, there was always a chance of historical rewriting or detail exclusion. Nonetheless, it was recorded that Makai was the body of God itself. The first being that traversed the emptiness created Makai. All creatures and life forms within it were their descendants. The main landmass of Makai was called the Matai Riku, or Demon Land. The landmass was several hundred times the combined landmass of Earth. The Eastern Sea was dubbed Dai Makai, or Great Sea of Evil, whose flaming temperatures exceeded 10,000 degrees Celsius, while the Western Sea was called Dai Maso, or Great Ocean of Evil, and pockets of ice there were at a temperature of absolute zero. The area where these seas met was a tumultuous 200-kilometer line of constant storms. Beyond these seas were impassable condensed atmospheric barriers that prevented any further travel. For this reason, it was deemed impossible to know the full size of the realm. Other ancient writing claimed there was a crack somewhere that led to a different dimension. The ground of Matai Riku was the color of blood. Within it were bottomless black fissures. Forests within Makai shifted eerily, and marshes emitted toxic gases that can melt flesh and bone. Even caves held poisonous miasma. At the center of Matai Riku was a mountain range called the Devil Mountains, 8,000 kilometers above sea level. Within this mountain range was a waterfall dubbed Heaven to Hell. It dragged any who approached it down into a darkness exceeding depths of over 3,000 kilometers below sea level. The Matai Riku was home to several hundred trillion creatures. Much like the inhabitants of the human realm, these creatures came in many varieties and alignments. Some were good, some were evil, some were indifferent, but just about all of them were interested in building their own territory and influence. Makai nobles, 2 million years ago. It was further written in the Genesis of Makai that the reign of Makai noble houses began 2 million years ago. The Demon King, Zabel Aensland, was written as the first emperor, although other records had apparently been lost, and magic was apparently unable to seek this truth. Needless to say, the full story surrounding the claim was unclear. Nonetheless, Zabel of House Aensland ruled Makai alongside other noble houses. The Three High Lords. The demons of Makai were divided up by strength, each giving a letter rating to denote their class. The High Lords, or High Nobles, were ranked at Class S, and they led the most powerful houses of Makai. These were 3. Garunan, master of the Vashtal family, the spirit lord known as the Brain of Makai. Garunan was the oldest of the 3 High Lords, approaching 32,000 years. He had been the Vashtal family master for the past 20,000. The Vashtal family held the best intelligence and information network in Makai. On top of that, his physical power was once nearly unrivaled, before his power waned with age. Nonetheless, he remained aggressive and cruel. His powers could summon demonic beasts from a realm called Inkai, the Shadow Realm in the deepest reaches of Makai. Normally, controlling these demonic beasts would generally require a great amount of power, but Garunan in particular could control their nervous systems directly, so he could direct them at will. As Garunan's age increased, his power and influence decreased, allowing the other 2 High Lords to overtake him in both aspects. Still, thanks to his unmatched informational network, along with his Shadow Beast controlling powers, he remained in his position at the head of the family. With less raw power and more political intelligence, his title became the Brain of Makai. He kept tabs on all other nobles in Makai, which generally dissuaded them from making any sudden power grabs, lest Garunan inform the other nobles and they quickly end up as the enemy of the entire realm. Jedah, master of the Doma family, the distressed Lord of Death, born 4045 BC. Jedah was the youngest of the 3 High Lords at around 6,000 years old. Jedah's powers included the ability to drain the souls of his targets and instantly add their strength to his own. He also carried within him an entrance to a different dimension, where he stored these excess souls. On top of that, he could shapeshift and ignore some damage thanks to a liquid body. Jedah was growing increasingly concerned about the future of the realm. He feared that the present leadership would lead to a stagnation of Makai. Unfortunately for him, there were too many checks in place for him to try to make a large play for a leadership change. Not only was Garunan's informational network keeping a close eye on him, he couldn't match the other High Lords in a direct contest of strength. Therefore, his best bet was to bide his time and hope for an opportunity. Belial Aensland. Truthfully, the descendant of Zabel Aensland was in a class all his own. Belial Aensland was presently the undisputed strongest of Makai and recorded as a class of S+, a cut above the other 2 High Lords. He was over 200 meters tall and had 4 arms. 2 of those arms had eyes in their palms, making his total eye count 4, including the 2 on his face. 2 of these arms were often sealed to reduce his power. When he had all 4 out, he could destroy 200 nobles with one swing of an arm. Belial possessed a special attack, named Scale Photon, which shot an arrow of highly compressed magic at its target. At full power, it could instantly kill Garunan or Jedah. Defensively, Belial's skin was covered in a thin protective barrier that could withstand temperatures of 1 million degrees Celsius. This barrier could also instantly vaporize any normal Makai creature that contacted it. To Belial, Makai was an extension of himself. Ruling over Makai was similar to ruling over his own body. Yet, even though his power was unmatched, he was no tyrant. Belial did not wish to conquer Makai and rule as a king. Rather, he was more of a benevolent overseer who cared for the well-being of all those within Makai. Belial's sheer power simply defied true understanding. Still, an estimate of his raw power was several 100,000 demon beasts, or several hundred A-class nobles. The A-class nobles. S-class was reserved for those who had the power to rule over Makai. A-class was reserved for those in the power class below this. Mostly nobles of various clans across the land. Of these, there were 7 who kept a close watch on the High Lords. The Lei-Lei family, led by Persimmon de Lepe. His family was an old family alongside the Aenslands, and his territory was that surrounding the Devil Mountain range. The Maximoff family. This family would eventually be led by Demitri Maximoff, who was a young and ambitious vampire. The Heartland family, led by Gregorio Heartland. He was a handsome noble who was closely attended by female demons. He lived a hedonistic lifestyle, and his top officer was named Majigen. The Kreutz family, led by Zell Kreutz. He had a draconic appearance, and his violent nature often led him into conflicts with Heartland. The Dre family, led by Taurus Dre. This collector of artifacts once owned the demon armor Hannya and demon blade Kien in their collection. The Gilman family, led by Sierra do Gilman. She was a spellcaster, historian, and philosopher, author of The Beginning of Darkness and Me and Makai. She spoke 78 languages and had mastered over 1,400 types of magic. The Funachika family, led by Ed Funachika. This was a clan of martial artists who practiced Makenpo, but this wasn't a martial art designed for battle. It should be noted that an attendant of Jedah's, Ozam, was also ranked at A+. Ozam was a manipulative noble, though his direct power level was low. He would find other ways to attain his goals. Below A class was B class demons. B+ class demons were warriors of above average power and skill. Creatures of B+ class were initially referred to as Darkstalkers. However, the term Darkstalkers would eventually encompass all creatures of Makai. Creatures of average skill and power were B class. C class was the servant class, acting as a working class for the nobles. Any humans trapped in Makai were placed in this class, assuming they survived. Of course, without these laborers, the Makai economy would instantly collapse. D-class creatures were the beasts of Makai. Though considered inferior, some could understand a little language and form societies. On top of this, some beasts were strong enough to rival even a B+ class demon in raw power. The Gate, 2,000 years ago. Within the Devil Mountain range existed a volcano, Gelala Gila, whose eruptions were once called a fire blizzard. After persisting since the time of Makai's creation, these eruptions oddly ceased. The ruler of the area was the Lepe clan, who sent a servant to investigate the volcano. After growing concerned about the volcano, Lepe himself investigated. Far above this volcano was a distortion that twisted light and gravity. The distortion opened and closed periodically on a 2-week cycle. When it was at its largest, Makai was physically connected to another realm, if only for a few seconds. When Lepe reached the distortion, he was sucked into the other realm, and the news quickly spread throughout Makai. The demons grew fearful of the distortion, assuming any who got sucked into the other dimension were doomed. Nobles of Makai claimed the distortion would be sealed, and they would not have to fear it any longer. However, in secret, the nobles researched the distortion, while keeping its existence hidden. The general public eventually forgot about the distortion, while the nobles determined its function. They came to call it the Gate, and it connected Makai to the human world. Within the human world was an important resource called Marioku, the demon's source of life and strength. In the human world, Marioku existed as souls that were specifically evil. They discovered that the human world contained enough Marioku to rival even the strength of the 3 high nobles. The nobles who learned of this suddenly had to track each other's movements very carefully. If one managed to claim the Marioku of the human world, they would grow incredibly powerful. As a result, a tension built between the nobles. Earth, 2664 BC. Even before the Gate was discovered in Makai, supernatural events were occurring on planet Earth. Anakaris was born in Egypt in the year 2664 BC. His father was Uros, the 11th pharaoh of an ancient kingdom, and he was said to be the 12th. The kingdom followed 9 commandments revolving around prayer, duty, and the king. The kingdom was described as the epitome of prosperity. When he was 7 years old, his father had a second son, but this second prince passed away at a young age. At the age of 9, Uros had a third son, Heterosos. In 2652 BC, Pharaoh Uros passed away at age 39, so at the age of 12, Anakaris became the 12th pharaoh of his kingdom. At this time, Anakaris had a vision. He foresaw his death, as well as a future resurrection. After this, he foresaw himself ensuring a safe future for his people. To prepare for this, he tasked his entire kingdom to construct a tomb for his burial. Not only did many of his subjects pass away from the construction, his brother also died of illness. Still, his people served him in the belief his vision would come true. Also, at some point, he was wed to a woman named Anna Maha. In the year 2633 BC, Anakaris' kingdom was invaded by a neighboring country. Anakaris led his people to war, but was slain in battle at age 27. As per his wishes, his body was mummified and brought to the Chamber of Revival in his pyramid. 520 AD, Phobos. Dormant Phobos robots were found by the Mayan people. The Mayans reprogrammed the robots and put them to work in various ways. One of their new directives was to protect Central America from the forces of evil. Eventually, they were returned to a dormant state in what would become the Teotihuacan ruins. 600 years ago, Hannya armor. Another strange occurrence happened around 1390 when a Makai beast entered the human world. It was named Hannya and was formerly in the A-class noble Dre's collection. This beast was shaped like a set of armor, and naturally humans would try to wear it. When they would, Hannya would exert its influence over the wearer, granting them immense combat prowess, while also clouding their judgment, ultimately transforming them into a bloodthirsty murderer. As the person wearing Hannya killed countless innocents, the armor would also drain the wearer's life force until there was nothing left but the armor itself. At this point, the armor would simply wait for the rumors of unstoppable might to spread and its next victim to put the armor on. Demitri Maximoff, 1483. Back in Makai, an A-class demon was born, the vampire named Demitri Maximoff. His natural form was demonic in appearance, yet he would develop a different, more human-like form styled as an aristocrat. Demitri lived in Castle Maximoff, also known as Zabel Zarock. He grew to be an arrogant man who believed it was his right to hold dominion over the other creatures of Makai. Kien, 1580. On Earth in the 1580s, a sword was forged and named Onikiri. This sword was specially designed for killing in large numbers. As most weapons would dull with use, Onikiri grew sharper with the more people it cut down. When used in combat, it would appear to onlookers that the sword sliced deeper into its victim, seemingly on its own. Rumors spread that the sword needed to kill one man a day, otherwise its wielder would lose their mind and perish. One day, the sword mysteriously disappeared when it was pulled to Makai. When it returned 10 years later, it was in a matching set with the demon sword Hannya. Onikiri had also mysteriously changed its name to Kien. 1673, Bishamon. In Japan, a man named Bishamon perused his friend's antique shop. While looking around, his gaze fell upon a set of armor and a sword. Moments later, he lost sense of himself and demanded the shop owner give him the set. When Bishamon regained his senses, he was at his house with the armor and the sword. He had no recollection of what had transpired moments before, so he returned to the antique shop to ask what had happened. The shop owner relayed the details, yet it was still unclear why he couldn't recall the event. Bishamon spent days and nights sitting in front of the armor, staring at it. His wife, Orin, grew concerned and suggested he throw the armor away. He refused and continued to gaze at it. After 2 weeks, Bishamon decided to put the armor on, even though his wife advised against it. The instant he put the armor on, his mind was filled with hate and bloodlust. He used his quickly fading willpower to tell his wife to run. The demon armor Hannya and the bloodthirsty blade Kien took full control of Bishamon's body. He slayed Orin, whose spirit left her body but continued to haunt Bishamon. For countless days, it killed innocents in the name of Hannya and Kien's bloodthirst. Succubi. Succubi were alluring monsters from Makai that used their appearance to attract potential victims. In general, the saliva and blood of succubi produced a powerful lust in their targets, which alone could become strong enough to kill a human on contact. After coming into contact with a succubus, a human's blood vessels would dilate, and they would begin to perspire. Most people would instantly fall under a succubus's control, unless they had a particularly strong willpower. Succubi tended to live for around 400 years. They gained their mature, beautiful adult form relatively quickly, and maintained it for several hundred years until they passed away. In Makai, within Belial's castle Aensland, dwelled a clan of succubi. Aensland succubi were somewhat different from their generic counterparts. Most succubi would drain the life force of their victims to sustain their life. Those of Castle Aensland use the physical and mental stimulation of others to generate a liquid within themselves. This liquid served as their fuel, allowing them to sustain their lives without directly draining the life force of others. Still, if that were their only form of sustenance, they would die if they ever found themselves alone for 2 days. As a solution, they found a way to enter the dreams of others from a distance. With the mental stimulation from these dreams, the Aensland succubi could survive, though the ones who had their dreams entered would wake suspecting their dream had been stolen. Unfortunately, there was a limited amount of sustenance that could be generated from a single target. As such, the dream-hunting succubi of Castle Aensland were in something of a food shortage. They began searching the human world for more targets. Initially, humans were a great source of dreams, though more recently, humans were having fewer dreams altogether, effectively recreating the food shortage. Even so, there were around 200 Aensland succubi remaining, and if something didn't change, they would die out in a couple generations. It was around this time that a particular succubus was born. She was unbelievably powerful, attaining an S-class rating even as an infant. The baby was brought before the castle's lord, Belial Aensland. He recognized her power as strong enough to one day rule over the entire Makai. As such, he adopted her. This was Morrigan Aensland. For the time being, Belial couldn't allow for an infant to wield her immense power without first giving her guidance. To curb the potential dangers, he split Morrigan's power into thirds. 1/3 remained within the infant. A second third Belial placed within himself. And the third he hid away in a small locked dimension. When he decided Morrigan was ready, he would return the other 2/3 to her and restore her true strength. Even with their separation, it appeared as though the various portions of Morrigan's soul were still drawn to each other. It was as if they wished to be reunited as one. Belial had a premonition. He foresaw that the next ruler of Makai would be born when Morrigan's soul reunited. For Morrigan's youth, this knowledge was kept from her. Nevertheless, she was lovingly raised by her adoptive father Belial. Of course, she would grow to find the confines of Castle Aensland too restrictive. Morrigan had a rougher personality than other succubi and searched for new kinds of stimuli. She was somewhat aloof and carefree. She would often sneak away from the castle to explore both Makai and the human world. This would lead to her personal attendants, Mudo and Peggy, covering for her escapades when reporting to Lord Belial. 10 years after Morrigan's soul was split, a strange occurrence happened in the sealed dimension. A message from Morrigan's heart reached out to the fractured soul, and it began to develop its own consciousness. Since Morrigan's soul had been so powerful, even the fractured portion was able to sustain an entire independent will. Morrigan herself never noticed this, and neither did Belial. The growing consciousness called herself Lilith, and she grew more aware over time. Thanks to her being able to enter dreams, she learned of Makai and felt a certain urge to return home. China, 1730. The twins Lei-Lei, also known as hsien-ko, and Lin-Lin, also known as Mei Ling, were born to a family of mystics. This Shao household had been the guardians of mystical arts for generations. In their youth, their mother taught them senjutsu, and they became powerful mystics in their own right. When the time came for the two twins to become full-fledged mystics, their village was attacked by a group of Darkstalkers. The mother of the twins sacrificed herself to protect her daughters. As a cost from the spell she used, her soul was trapped in darkness. Unfortunately, the twins had not yet learned the reincarnation spell. The twins came up with a plan to save their mother's soul. Lei-Lei and Lin-Lin each cast a high-level transformation spell, the Ikkyo Tenshin no Jutsu. Lei-Lei transformed herself into an undead Jiangshi in an attempt to gain a stronger form with which to fight the Darkstalkers. Simultaneously, Lin-Lin transformed herself into a paper talisman to help Lei-Lei maintain her senses and control her new form. Without Lin-Lin's talisman, Lei-Lei was at risk of losing control and falling to the dark impulses of her new undead form. The pair served as Darkstalker hunters and fought through the creatures until they reached their mother's trapped soul. They carried on hunting Darkstalkers until they managed to rescue their mother's soul from darkness. However, they gave their own lives in the process. Their mother's soul used her abilities to grant her daughters a reincarnation to a happy family in a future life. Darkhunters. As Darkstalkers slipped into the human world, humans found a need to protect themselves. Much like how Lei-Lei and Lin-Lin became Darkstalker hunters, other humans took up the mantle of protecting humanity from the creatures of Makai. These were called Darkhunters for short. Garunan's death. In Makai's 1790, the tension between the nobles boiled over when one of the three High Lords, Garunan, died at the age of 32,000. Without Garunan, the intelligence network he operated was no more. No one could keep tabs on the other nobles as well as Garunan could, so anyone who had been waiting to exploit the human realm was now free to do so. Jedah's opportunity for a power shift had arrived. His informant Ozam suggested he travel to the sealed gate and absorb souls from the human realm. Ozam intended to provide more souls than Jedah expected, and he hoped the huge sudden influx of power would destroy even Jedah. Then he could replace Jedah as a High Lord of Makai. Nonetheless, Ozam pretended to support Jedah's attempt at a power grab. Ozam's plot went according to plan for the most part. Jedah managed to absorb more power than Ozam had predicted, but he was still destroyed. Ozam gathered the leftover energy and placed it in Doma Castle, then claimed himself the leader of the Doma family. Belial saw the growing chaos in Makai, however he had also foreseen his coming demise. He predicted the Aensland family wasn't going to have an heir strong enough to reign over Makai for another 1,200 years, so he named his adoptive daughter, Morrigan, as his rightful heir. She was still relatively young, and her full powers were still not her own to control. But even outside of this, there was political pushback of naming an adopted child as heir. At this point, the gate between the human realm and Makai was more open. This made Darkstalker encounters more common. As a result, Darkhunters became more common to combat them. 1830. Victor. Germany was home to a scientist by the name Professor Victor von Gerdenheim. He was long reprimanded for his research, as each of his projects had some type of humane or ethical concern. For these reasons, Professor Victor was labeled as a dangerous person by the Medical Academic Research Council. It should be noted that the Research Council was operated by a mafia. Nonetheless, Professor von Gerdenheim carried on his research into the revival of dead cells. Rumors swirled about the man. Many called him insane or addicted to drugs or a publicity chaser. The public turned against him and his research, even though these rumors were false. As a result, his ability to present his research findings was fully revoked by the council. He was silenced and forgotten. Victor von Gerdenheim wasn't deterred. If anything, this just gave him more time to focus in solitude. He moved his lab to an abandoned hospital in the countryside and pursued his ultimate goal of creating life. Over the next 20 to 30 years, he worked on his goal, slowly growing mad in the process. Professor von Gerdenheim worked on a prototype named Emily. Emily was essentially a functioning doll constructed from human bodies. When supplied with electrical current, Emily could animate, but only for 30 seconds at a time. Still, this was encouraging enough to work on another creation, one that could generate its own electricity to sustain itself indefinitely. Professor Victor von Gerdenheim recorded his process to create life. He started with collecting human remains and combining them into a large humanoid structure. Then he placed his secret electrostatic organic material into the construct's nerve and muscle tissue. The tissue was soaked in a revival liquid created by the doctor and stored at -18 degrees for 200 hours. The heart was given a pacemaker, and a charged liquid was circulated in the body's veins. Finally, a high voltage needed to be applied to the construct. The professor had to rely on lightning to accomplish this. The experiment was a success. Once lightning struck the body, it became animated. Simultaneously, current flowed through the prototype Emily's body as well, fully animating her. Professor Victor von Gerdenheim was also electrocuted and perished, but not before he named his newest creation Victor after himself. Victor the creation was unfamiliar with death and still felt indebted to his creator. Victor figured if he hunted a bunch of Darkstalkers, he would prove his strength, and the professor would be proud. The construct defeated many lesser Darkstalkers, but when he returned to the castle, the professor hadn't moved. Still, he and Emily continued to live in the castle. Dimitri's rebellion, 100 years ago. Dimitri's ambition came to a head. He decided to fight against Belial for control over Makai. Belial quickly defeated Demitri with a low-powered scale photon shot. Then he took Maximoff's castle and sent it through the gate to the human realm, effectively exiling Demitri. To add insult to injury, Dimitri's rank of A-class was demoted to B following his defeat. Unfortunately for Belial, as a consequence of tampering so heavily with the realms, Belial's power began to fade away. Initially, this wasn't an issue. Jedah and Garunan had already died, and even though Ozam was calling himself Emperor of Makai, his power still paled in comparison to Belial's. Nevertheless, it became clear that there would come a day when Belial's power faded completely. The next ruler would need to be trained, lest Makai fall into disorder and violence. The time was coming when Belial needed to speak to Morrigan about the future of Makai and her hidden power. Demitri in Romania. Demitri and his castle landed in Romania. He was severely wounded and weakened from his battle with Belial. The sun of the human world had adverse effects for most beings from Makai, but this was exacerbated for Demitri in his present state. If he were to be exposed to the sun, his weakened body would disintegrate and he would die. Demitri used his remaining strength to cover his castle in a protective barrier. He spent the majority of the next 50 years recovering in a casket. When he would leave the castle, it would be on the night of a full moon, and he would create a protective barrier around himself. Humans in the region grew curious about the castle, which only seemed accessible during the full moon. Rumors spread about the potential dangers or potential riches within its walls. Groups of people would approach the castle with weapons of silver, garlic, and crosses, thinking that they would protect him from the castle's master. Demitri had no trouble dispatching these trespassers. He may have been weakened, but the humans were still no match for him. Demitri drained them of their blood and eventually took to draining the blood of nearby residents as well. He preferred the blood of innocent women the most, particularly those with AB blood type. Many of those that he drained became his loyal servants. In time, Demitri would host lavish balls and banquets in his castle, inviting those who agreed to become his thralls. Once Demitri had recovered around 80% of his power, he could generate a barrier around himself to survive the daylight. At this point, he was all but unstoppable in the human world. Still, his goal of ruling Makai hadn't changed. He continued recovering and began strengthening himself for his eventual return. 1889, Zabel Zarock. There was a charismatic young guitarist from Australia named Zabel Zarock, aka Lord Raptor. At some point, this young rocker came across a strange leather-bound book. The book introduced him to the realm called Makai. He began using some of the book's passages as lyrics for his songs. He also discovered a particular curse designed to give sacrifices to the overlord of Makai. Of course, none of this was outright stated in his discography. Despite his growing popularity, he managed to conceal his dark intentions while he worked independently on rock albums. His first release, Oral Dead, was initially met with middling sales. However, after receiving some support, his popularity skyrocketed in the metal music scene. His second album sold 200,000 copies in a single month, and 1 million in 3 months. Zabel's fans were largely in their teenage years, but they were radically devoted to his music. The morning before one of his concerts, a violent brawl broke out, prompting law enforcement to cancel his performance. Still, Zabel wasn't deterred. During what would become his final live performance, Zabel addressed his fans as a cult leader would. He invited his devoted followers underground to his personal recording studio. There, Zabel performed his final song entitled Sacrifice. In doing so, he convinced 100 of his fans to give their lives alongside himself. Mysteriously, the fans' bodies were drained of blood, while his body was reduced to a bleached skeleton. Investigators were perplexed by the gruesome scene. Though each of the bodies had been drained of blood, there was no external wounds. After Zabel's book was discovered, it was speculated that Zabel had brainwashed his fans and used them as sacrifices. This thought was supported by the lyrics in his songs being taken directly from the book. Still, without any real way to prove this, his songs remained in circulation. After he performed his sacrifice, Ozom recognized Zabel. Ozom resurrected Zabel as a zombie. Then he claimed if Zabel managed to kill other Darkstalkers, he would be granted even more power. Zabel agreed, but secretly plotted against Ozom to one day kill him and take his place. Ozom placed a spy in charge of keeping tabs on Zabel. This was Limalta, one of the few Makai beasts capable of freely traveling between the human world and Makai. As it turned out, Limalta and Zabel got along quite well, with a piece of Limalta becoming Zabel's new guitar. 1903, Sasquatch. In the mountains of Canada was a hidden village of Bigfoot. Thanks to the natural terrain and below freezing conditions, this village was well hidden from the senses of humans. This village had approximately 100 Bigfoot, and they lived in a close-knit society. Interestingly, the tribe used a network of Makai seals as well as Makai beasts to transfer information all across the planet. The Bigfoot tribe had a close relation to various Makai beasts. These included mock crabs, snowshoe penguins, snowmen, snow beasts, and the small Makai whale. Many of these lived in the same village and often assisted Bigfoot in battle. For the most part, Bigfoot were docile and friendly to creatures that showed them kindness and respect. That being said, they did once hold some largely forgotten ambitions for world domination. Nevertheless, if they are threatened or disrespected, they have great combat prowess. The Bigfoot tribe held one noble warrior in great esteem. His name was Sasquatch. He had won the village's most recent Who's the Strongest in the Village snow sumo tournament. The tribe's leader was the elder Tundra, and Sasquatch's closest combat rival was Don Ketcho. As something of a reward for winning the snow sumo tournament, Sasquatch was granted permission to protect the village from monsters' threats on its outskirts. 1940. Galen. Boraba Kreutz, aka the Wolf Lord, was the leader of the royal guard for one of the noble families of Makai. The combat prowess of his order was known throughout Makai. They were disciplined and skilled enough to defeat lesser Darkstalkers in one blow. Even Demitri considered Boraba something close to an equal in strength. The leader of the family he served was the draconic A-rank, Zabel Kreutz. At some point around 1920, Boraba wandered into the human world, injured and with memory loss. While there, a human woman cared for him and treated his wounds. After he had recovered, Boraba returned to Makai and resumed his duties. 10 years after this, however, Boraba disappeared. This was strange for a loyal guard of the Kreutz family. The disappearance prompted Zell to search for him, but he was never found. It was suspected that Boraba returned to the human world to spend his days with a human woman that treated him in his time of need. Years later in England, Galen was born to a single mother who passed away shortly after. He had no way of knowing how to track down his father, so he survived alone. As he grew, it became clear that he was part Darkstalker. There was a side of him that continued to gain control over his being and threatened to someday consume him entirely. One night, under a full moon, Galen's body transformed into that of a werewolf. Due to the humans' prejudice against all Darkstalkers, Galen was shunned from human society. He felt upset at the curse he was given, but felt no anger toward his parents themselves. Galen searched for a way to remove his Darkstalker blood, or to help control it. Galen took up training in martial arts. He came to the belief that if he could master his body, he could maintain a fully human form. He trained daily, but he often felt the hunger of his other half. Donovan Baine. Galen wasn't the only being that had blood of both human and Darkstalker in their veins. Another such being was Donovan Baine, a Dhampir, half human, half vampire. Throughout his youth, he and his mother were treated as outcasts due to his half Darkstalker heritage. As such, Donovan hated the demon blood that coursed in his veins. One night, unfortunate circumstances struck as he lost control of himself and succumbed to his Darkstalker influence. When the young Donovan came to, he realized he had killed many innocent people of his village. Donovan grieved and resolved to find a way to control his Darkstalker side. He became a wanderer until he found a Buddhist monk temple. He devoted his life to Buddhism for the next decade, yet he could not attain peace. Through his inner turmoil, he decided to travel the world with a quest. He traveled and resolved to slay Darkstalkers as a Dark Hunter. 1953, Aulbath. Within the Amazon rainforest of Brazil, a kingdom of approximately 30,000 mer-people lived, hidden from human detection. The aquatic empire was governed by the Emperor Aulbath, aka Rikuo. Unlike most human monarchies, there was a selection process to determine their rulers, rather than a birthright in a royal family. A previous ruler would nominate their successor, and after being approved by the citizens, the nominee would be next in line for rule. As such, the mer-people were tightly knit and very community-focused. Each mer person took their role seriously, whether it was to gather food, protect the empire, or raise the youth. The empire existed mostly within freshwater lakes, but in recent years, seawater began flowing in, which increased the salt levels of their environment. Potentially due to this reason, birth rates for the mer people were declining. 1967, Catwomen. Catwomen began appearing in the human world. Though they were indeed supernatural, humanity didn't attack them immediately. Instead of treating them as monsters, people saw the Catwomen as docile creatures. Even so, there was some debate as to whether they should be treated like humans with all the rights therein. Catwomen eventually received basic human rights, but a substantial degree of prejudice against them remained. Upon birth, Catwomen were indistinguishable from human infants. However, in their youth, they grew ears, a tail, and fur. They further developed a shape-shifting ability to transform into a form resembling a typical human, as well as a form resembling a general house cat. Strangely enough, there were no Catmen in the human world, leading people to believe they could only exist in Makai. Felicia, 1967. One Catwoman was left in the care of an orphanage as a baby. She was raised by a nun, Sister Rose, and given the name Felicia. Sister Rose was remarkably kind. After Felicia turned 6 and was revealed to be a Darkstalker, Sister Rose adopted her and left the area to keep her safe from potential threats. In time, Rose passed away. Outside of Sister Rose, Felicia didn't have any good memories of the town she grew up in. Looking back, she wished humans had treated her better. Felicia wanted to show the world that they could be nice to beings like her, Darkstalker or otherwise. It wasn't always necessary for humans to be afraid or antagonistic towards Darkstalkers. To prove this, Felicia decided to travel the world and become a music star. That way, she could show the world that some Darkstalkers were worthy of praise and adoration. Of course, she could still handle herself in a fight in case some ill-intentioned beings crossed her path during her travels. Pyron's return. After 65 million years of slumber, Pyron reawakened in the Pacific Ocean. The presence of his immensely powerful form caused a huge number of supernatural consequences throughout the human world and even caused disturbances in Makai. With Pyron's arrival, one of the Phobos robots awakened and prepared to carry out its orders once more. The first event of note at the arrival of Pyron was the resurrection of Anakaris. This was the day Anakaris witnessed in his vision 5,000 years prior. Anakaris emerged from his tomb with a new mummified form. He had full control over his golden mask and layered cloth wrappings. As his first order of business, Anakaris exited his tomb and surveyed what remained of his kingdom. He was saddened to see a barren stretch of desert in his kingdom's place. Anakaris recalled his vision where he had ensured a future for his people. To make his vision manifest, he time-traveled, returning to the past. Anakaris emerged in the year 2630 BC, and witnessed as the enemy kingdom's invasion continued to destroy his own kingdom. Anakaris rallied his troops to turn the tide of the war. He indeed repelled the enemy forces. However, he did not stop after the enemy invasion force was defeated. Instead, Anakaris led his troops into the enemy kingdom and conquered it. After this event, Anakaris heard a voice beckoning him to return to the future. Anakaris and his kingdom disappeared from freshly rewritten history. Back during the time of Pyron's reawakening, instability shook the planet. Unfortunately for the Mer people, an earthquake triggered a nearby volcanic eruption. These natural disasters caused by Pyron destroyed the Empire, seemingly killing everyone aside from Aulbath. Aulbath swore vengeance against Pyron. However, his plot for revenge was derailed when he met another survivor, Aquaria. Aquaria had been swimming on the outskirts of the Merperson kingdom when the disaster struck. A rip current swept her away from the destruction and spouted her deep into the Amazon rainforest. She had nowhere to go and no way to find her way back to the destroyed kingdom, so she found shelter within a lake. After waiting there for a few days, she made up her mind to search for other survivors. She followed an underground river that led her back to where her kingdom once stood. It was now engulfed in a great black fissure. She knew no one could have survived the destruction, yet even as she was disheartened, she believed the Merperson's emperor Aulbath must have survived. For half a year, Aquaria clung to that hope, and near the time when Aulbath swore his revenge, the two were reunited. The pair were overjoyed to find one another, and were quickly wed. They moved away from the destroyed empire and began building a life in the greater ocean. The pair had children, 3 sons at first, and a dozen other children and soon to hatch eggs. Now that Aulbath had more in life, he gave himself the task of protecting his family and searching for other survivors in the Empire's fall. Unfortunately, he found his searches dragging him further and further from home. Within Makai, Morrigan sensed the strange disturbance from the human world. The ever-rebellious and curious succubus snuck away from Aensland Castle and searched the human world for its source. In Bigfoot Village, Sasquatch also sensed the monster's power, and as their strongest warrior, he left the village to find its source. Victor continued fighting to show his strength and make his creator proud. Felicia was still in the midst of her journey when Pyron returned. She quickly found herself caught up in the various battles between Darkstalkers. Zabel took his chance to battle the Darkstalkers. After doing so, Zabel approached Ozam, claiming his victory. Ozam granted him the power he promised, giving Zabel a new form. However, this was a deception from Ozam. The increase to Zabel's power was superficial and temporary. Yet even before this became clear, Zabel plotted to defeat Ozam himself and take his place. Bishamon encountered Pyron directly, and the two did battle. Pyron's energies managed to free Bishamon from the cursed armor's control, returning him to a human state. The freed Bishamon removed himself from the battle and became a monk. His wife Oren's spirit was also returned to her body. Together they created the spiritual practice of Ropodo and spread it throughout Japan. Galen also encountered Pyron, and after the encounter, Galen was left in a wholly human state. However, though it appeared to be permanent, this was only an illusion. The arrival of a powerful alien was an unprecedented opportunity for the vampire Demitri. He searched for Pyron, and they fought. Demitri came out victorious and drained the immensely powerful Pyron, gaining his powers. Demitri was now more confident than ever. He decided this was the time to return to Makai and defeat its ruler Belial. While Morrigan had been away from Makai, Belial had faded away. When she returned, she learned of the unfortunate news. Since Morrigan had been absent, the fraction of Morrigan's power within Belial himself was seemingly lost. Therefore, Belial's premonition about the next Makai ruler appearing when Morrigan returned to full power was on hold. She also now learned about the other fraction of her power sealed away in an unspecified location. To top it all off, it was clear that she was now the leader of the Aensland family, and as such held dominion over Makai. Morrigan responded to this responsibility with a general disinterest. She never officially accepted her position as head of the Aensland family, but the various nobles of Makai recognized her as such regardless. When Demitri returned to Makai to challenge Belial, he learned of his target's death, and his replacement Morrigan Aensland. So Demitri shifted his focus to defeating Morrigan. Morrigan largely ignored Demitri and evaded his attempts at a confrontation. Rather, she continued living as she did before, often sneaking off to the human world to find entertainment. Bulleta. In recent years, dark hunting became something different from the original practice. It became clear that creatures of Makai held value in the human world. They were seen as potential trophies or trinkets of valor. They were also valuable test subjects for study and experimentation. Of course, the associated risk for hunting a Darkstalker was still incredibly high. Even a C-class Makai beast could defeat an army of elite military-trained human soldiers in combat. For humans, engaging in battle with Darkstalkers required remarkably strong willpower and mental fortitude. On top of this, the possession of a dark heart helps them from being tainted by the Darkstalkers they hunt. Even with the potential dangers, the reward for dark hunting was enough for there to be several hundred dark hunters of varying skill levels. A rare S-class dark hunter existed. Even more rare was that she appeared to be a child, though her exact age was unknown. Bulleta, aka BB Hood, had gotten her start in dark hunting by hunting werewolves. She grew to become a part of the Hunters Guild in the Northern European Alpine branch. As such, she had access to the highest grade tools and technology, though much of it was obtained through illegal means. She tracked Darkstalker movements through the use of a camouflaged military satellite, Catastrophe. At the current moment, Bulleta was training to partake in a dark hunting competition, where various hunters chose a target and raced to see who could take it down first. This was the Dark Hunting Grand Prix, which occurred twice a year. A mysterious Mr. K would handle her reward whenever she completed a hunt. Bulleta traveled with a dog companion named Harry. Personality-wise, she generally carried an innocent and unassuming demeanor. This was supported by the fact that she cared for an elderly woman that Bulleta claimed was her grandmother Margaret. Oddly enough, the elderly woman's true identity was shrouded in mystery. Truthfully, Bulleta reveled in hunting and killing creatures of Makai. This trait pointed toward her dark heart, although there were times when she was genuinely kind. Anita. Dark hunters such as Donovan or Lei-Lei and Lin-Lin fought Darkstalkers not for monetary gain, but for righteous reasons. Donovan continued fighting off Darkstalkers to help ease his heart and find peace. During one of his travels, he came across an orphanage. There, he met a young girl named Anita with vacant eyes. Anita apparently had mysterious, inhuman powers. This, combined with a general prejudice against anything supernatural, caused her to be rejected by humanity. The resulting loneliness caused Anita to lose her emotions. Donovan saw something of himself within the girl. Donovan thought if he could restore her heart, his too would find peace. He invited Anita to join him on his travels, hunting Darkstalkers. She agreed and was adopted by Donovan. As she followed along, she carried her headless doll, which served as a memento from her mother. As the pair traveled together, Donovan came across a mystical longsword in a Tibetan monastery. This was the demon blade Dailek. It emitted unholy energy, which helped to increase Donovan's power, but ran the risk of overwhelming him. With the use of prayer beads, Donovan could somewhat safely call upon the sword's unnatural power. The blade itself was classified as a Makai beast with its own awareness. Phobos. Strangely enough, the operational Phobos robot malfunctioned and began following an order to protect a child. This child was named Cecil, and he would cheer for Phobos whenever the robot was engaged in combat. Lei-Lei and Lin-Lin Resurrection. After rescuing their mother's soul centuries prior, the twins Lei-Lei and Lin-Lin were reincarnated. born again as twins to an everyday family. They lived ordinary lives until their 16th birthday, where they had a shared dream regarding a dark savior. The next night, their powers and memories returned from their past lives. Furthermore, the mother of their past selves bestowed greater power upon the pair as a thanks for saving her soul from darkness. While the reason for this awakening was not abundantly clear, something supernatural was occurring. The Dark Savior. From the time of his destruction, Jedah's consciousness had slipped into an interstitial space. His scattered remains gathered in a remote region of Makai. There, in the outskirts of Makai, Jedah Domo was resurrected. He still felt concern for Makai. He also still wished to stop Darkstalkers from killing one another. But this time, his approach was going to be different. He initially planned to create his own dimension, named Majigen, but his powers had not fully recovered at this time. So, Jedah returned to Doma Castle and approached Ozam, the one who had betrayed him in his last life. The sight of Jedah's return clearly frightened Ozam. Still, Jedah politely asked for Ozam's assistance in creating his new dimension. Ozam remained paralyzed by fear, and Jedah used his soul to become the foundation of Majigen. Doma Castle was pulled into this new dimension. Jedah's new approach to save Makai from growing instability and conflict was to create something new. He aimed to stop conflict by creating a single life form born from the fusion of all souls deemed valuable. He called this form the Shintai, the sacred entity. The embryo of this new life form resided in Majigen. Jedah styled himself as a savior for the Darkstalkers, who would surely lead themselves towards destruction without his help. From Ozam's soul, Majigen was created. Here he would collect the souls of the Darkstalkers that were deemed valuable. Lilith. The fraction of Morrigan's soul that had been sealed away finally had an opportunity. Jedah sought her out and proposed a deal of sorts. Lilith had grown endlessly curious about the realms outside her own. Jedah proposed in return for granting her a body and pulling her out of the sealed dimension, she would help lure other Darkstalkers to Majigen. Of course, this included Morrigan, who Jedah could not ignore. At the time, Jedah simply claimed he aimed to grant the Darkstalkers salvation, which Lilith naively didn't question. Jedah brought her out of the sealed dimension and gave her the power to create a temporary body. Lilith's body was a reflection of her own self-image. She was indeed very similar to Morrigan, only with less worldly experience. As such, she appeared more like a child, though she and Morrigan were really one and the same. Lilith was remarkably curious about the realm she now had access to. As she explored the world searching for Darkstalkers, she understandably felt drawn to Morrigan. Personality-wise, she expressed a mix of naivety, curiosity, and cruelty. Since she was a succubus, she would sometimes say suggestive things without even realizing it. With Lilith on his side, Jedah prepared to launch a summoning signal to attract valuable souls to Majigen. QB. There was a race of Makai beasts that had long lived on the lands of the Doma House. The Soul Bee race survived by consuming the souls of their victims. Similar to a colony of bees from the human world, Soul Bees followed a queen, which was titled the QB. The potential QB was defined at birth, as they were born with a rare honey stomach. The QB also had simple intelligence similar to that of a young human child. Other Soul Bees were either called PBs or simply Ps. Each colony had from 50 to 150 Soul Bees within it. Following Ozam's betrayal of Jedah, lands surrounding Castle Doma were left unattended. The Soul Bees faced a harsh famine, and that paired with their remarkably high metabolism placed them on the verge of dying out. Fortunately for the Soul Bees, Jedah was revived, and his first order of business was creating Majigen to collect souls. As the leader, QB was drawn to Majigen to get food for herself as well as her colony of Soul Bees. Into Majigen. Jedah launched his summoning spell throughout the human realm and Makai. Not every valuable soul would hear it or respond, but QB and Lilith could potentially lend their aid in these cases. Now, it was almost impossible for all these Darkstalkers and Darkhunters to enter the same place without conflict. In the distant past, Anakaris heard a voice calling to him. The voice was claiming worthy souls should join with it. Anakaris was angered and considered the anonymous summoning an attack on his pride. Anakaris followed the summoning and entered Majigen. As Aulbath searched for other survivors of his destroyed kingdom, he spent increasingly less time with his growing family. When he returned home from one of his searches, he learned that one of his sons had disappeared. Aulbath believed he had been pulled into Jedah's Majigen, so Aulbath resolved to enter Majigen as well to retrieve his son. As Jedah scanned the human world for valuable Darkstalker souls, he came across Bulleta, the young S-class hunter. Bulleta was purely a human, but her dark nature caused Jedah to mistakenly assume she was a Darkstalker. So, he mistakenly pulled Bulleta into Majigen. Bulleta looked at the new environment and chuckled. She had been presented with a whole dimension consisting of nothing but Darkstalkers for her hunting. She stood to make a lot of money here, and she was going to be quite busy. Years after Bishamon had been freed from Hannya and Kien's curse, he stumbled upon an old temple with stories about another realm called Makai. Also within the temple's writings were stories about demons, a couple of which had familiar shapes of Hannya and Kien. Bishamon considered the possibility of someone falling to the same fate he had long ago and wearing the demon armor. He figured he would have to find Makai and seal the demon armor away. Bishamon proceeded to meditate while picturing Hannya and Kien. At this time, Hannya grew bloodthirsty once again. Even though they didn't have a host, the demon armor and sword moved on their own. They gathered a group of souls and bound them together to form a body. Hannya decided to keep the name Bishamon because the demon armor liked it. Just then, Hannya and Kien were pulled into Majigen. This was all well and good because the demon armor wished to begin slaying Darkstalkers. Demitri had been preparing for his confrontation with Morrigan to determine who would rule Makai. While he was tracking the succubus down, his castle was pulled into Majigen by Jedah. Demitri recognized that Jedah was at one point one of the 3 High Lords of Makai. Even if he managed to slay Morrigan, he would likely have to defeat Jedah if he wanted to rule alone. For this reason, he shifted his focus for the time being toward defeating Jedah. In the time since Pyron's return, Felicia had become a music star and thus accomplished her dream. She was much happier now than she was as a lonely child. However, she still understood that many people felt the way she once did. While she contemplated a way to help those who dealt with such feelings, she was swept away into Majigen. Galen had begun training 2 young boys in the ways of martial arts. Their names were Fred and his younger brother Marco. However, when Galen was pulled into Majigen, it became abundantly clear that he had not truly been cured of his demonic heritage. During his many fights, he was forced to push himself past his limits, all while confronting the darkness that dwelled within. Perhaps his only answers lied in the heart of battle. Lei-Lei and Lin-Lin had recovered their abilities and memories from their previous lives as Darkhunters. The moment they awoke to their powers, Jedah's summoning spell sensed them and dragged them into Majigen. Lei-Lei and Lin-Lin didn't understand why they had been brought to Majigen. The memories from their previous lives had little to do with the current set of circumstances. Still, they assumed they would have to fight their way through if they wished to return to their lives in the human world. Similar to Castle Maximoff, Aensland Castle was also pulled into Majigen by Jedah. The thought of trouble brewing excited the succubus Morrigan. Inside Majigen, Morrigan immediately sensed Lilith's voice calling out to her. With her curiosity piqued, she began searching. Sasquatch had just now returned to Bigfoot Village after leaving to confront Pyron. However, once he got back, he saw that the village had disappeared, leaving a crater where it once stood. Sasquatch tracked the disappearance to Jedah and entered Majigen to find answers. One night in Germany, Emily's functions ceased. Victor was concerned and figured he could revive her if he gathered enough souls to help power her. To accomplish this, Victor entered the realm with a high concentration of powerful souls, Jedah's Majigen. Zabel had always planned on betraying Ozam and taking his place. Malta had intended on warning Ozam about this. However, when the time came to confront his master, Zabel found that Ozam and the castle he lived in had vanished. In their place was a portal to a new dimension, Majigen. Zabel's plans changed slightly. Instead of killing Ozam and taking his place, he decided he would try killing Jedah and ruling over this new dimension. Malta also recognized that Ozam was gone, so the Makai beast began serving Zabel instead. The Savior's End. After Jedah's plan had been foiled, and the fighting within Majigen had ceased, the various Darkstalkers and Darkhunters went on their own ways. Anakaris had a vision that his kingdom was destined to be destroyed. He rejected this thought. Instead of allowing his kingdom to be destroyed, he traveled back in time once again and teleported his kingdom underground to keep it safe from the wars on the surface. He called this nation the True Country. This event was reflected in history books by stating that Anakaris' kingdom vanished in 26XX BC. Aulbath had searched Majigen for his son, but couldn't find him. As it turned out, Aulbath found his son with a new race of merpeople in Makai's oceans. The 2 families joined together to help rebuild the kingdom of merpeople. Before Hannya and Kien were able to slay anyone, they were confronted by the true Bishamon. Bishamon managed to seal the demon armor away, and from then on, assumed to live a life of peace. With some protection offered from the mother of their previous lives, Lei-Lei and Lin-Lin managed to survive the events within Majigen. They returned to the human world and settled back into their normal lives. While in Majigen, Bulleta learned of Makai and took the opportunity to go on a Darkstalker killing spree. Only after Sasquatch had arrived in Majigen did he learn the people of Bigfoot Village had willingly entered because Jedah had offered them a large amount of bananas. Victor was unable to revive Emily with the souls of Majigen. Instead, he decided to sacrifice his own power to restore Emily's. He was successful, but it cost him his life. Felicia opened an orphanage called the Felicity House, and became known as the singing, dancing, musical sister. Galen contemplated whether or not he should return to the two disciples he'd been training in the martial arts. Lilith and Morrigan finally met, and their souls reunited. Morrigan immediately felt more powerful, though this was only 2/3 of Morrigan's original soul. With Lilith's influence, she decided to place the Isis ring on her finger. This ring denoted that she was indeed the master of the Aensland family, a responsibility she had been ignoring since Belial's death. It remained unclear if she fully accepted the responsibility of ruling the demon realm, or if this was another of her passing whims. Extras and secrets. There are a couple hidden Darkstalkers who appear to have the ability to control bodies of their defeated opponents. These are Marionette and Shadow. Oboro Bishamon is the human Bishamon who instead took control of the demon armor and sword with the power of Buddhism. Dark Galen is the Darkstalker side of Galen without his human side repressing it. Donovan Baine had slain many Darkstalkers throughout his travels, but in doing so, the blood of his victims only further amplified his own demonic blood. He eventually succumbed to his demonic side, transforming into a Darkstalker known as D. D went on a killing spree, slaying all in his path regardless of their origin. It seemed anything that remained of Donovan was now gone. He would eventually face an emotionless young lady, the same one he had once adopted from an orphanage. She was of course older now, and she was forced to put an end to Dee's rampage. Later, in a cemetery where the young lady mourned her loss, she shed a tear, and her hand glowed with a reddish light. Excluded endings. The arcade endings couldn't all be canon, but included in the story were all those that were canonically possible. The following are the other endings. Vampire. Morrigan is shown draining Pyron's energy, but this can't be since Capcom stated Pyron's energy was drained by Demitri. Sasquatch's ending shows the Bigfoot tribe rallying an army, but that is contradicted by Capcom's claim that they were mainly peaceful. Vampire Hunter. After defeating Pyron, Phobos returned to the Mayan ruins and prepared to wipe life from the planet once more, alongside an army of the other robots. However, Pyron was defeated by Demitri, and the characterization of Phobos changed in the later releases. When Pyron won, he added Earth to his collection of planets. This of course was contradicted by Pyron's defeat at the hands of Demitri. Vampire Savior. Demitri defeated Morrigan and tried to drain her power, but Morrigan turned herself to stone in order to avoid this fate. Jedah's ending showed him destroying Makai and placing all their souls into the sacred entity. He placed his soul in the life form as well as its primary controller. He then resolved to destroy the human world before their ruler fully awakened. This ruler was implied to be Anita. Zabel attempted to absorb all the souls he could, but he exploded, much like Jedah had 100 years prior. QB's ending showed her building a giant soul beehive over the demon world. Vampire Hunter 2 and Vampire Savior 2. All of these endings were the same outside of the bosses for each game. Vampire Hunter 2 foreshadowed Jedah's arrival, while Vampire Savior 2 showed Jedah's defeat, but still showed the sacred entity remained. Furthermore, there was still the possibility that Jedah could resurrect once more and attempt his plan again. If Pyron won in Vampire Hunter 2, his victory accelerated Jedah's revival. Pyron was unknowingly assimilated into Jedah. If Jedah won in Vampire Savior 2, the sacred entity in the Majigen was complete. It was now ready to assimilate all souls in Makai. Notes. The fellow Capcom game, Ghosts and Goblins, also had a Makai. Since it is somewhat confusing, here's how the games were released. 1. Vampire the Night Warriors, aka Darkstalkers the Night Warriors. 2. Vampire Hunter Darkstalkers Revenge, aka Night Warriors Darkstalkers Revenge. 3. Vampire Savior the Lord of Vampire, aka Darkstalkers 3. Finally, there were the arcade updates to Vampire Savior. These were Vampire Hunter 2 and Vampire Savior 2. Dee's hidden story is presented as more possible than Oboro Bishamon and Dark Galen. This is mainly due to the statements made by story and concept planner Haruo Murata in the Darkstalkers official Complete Works interview. It appeared as though this was the intended storyline for Donovan and Anita, though it wasn't explicitly stated as canon. Felicia has some fourth wall breaking moments referencing games like Puzzle Fighter and Street Fighter's Blanca. Sources: the games Darkstalkers 1 through 3, Darkstalkers official Complete Works, the Darkstalkers graphic file, the All About magazines, All About Vampire, All About Vampire Hunter, and All About Vampire Savior, Gamist Magazine Book, Gamist Mook, Volume 88, Vampire Savior Fan Book, Finally, much of the information from the above sources was translated and summarized in Psyche's GameFAQ lore guide. This in itself was a very valuable source, though not an official Capcom work. Thank you for watching.